Good afternoon, Justin. Good afternoon to our audience. It's a pleasure to welcome Justin Westcott today. So a little bit of background. I first met Justin at the South African Military Academy when he was working very hard on cybersecurity already then, and specifically as well on different drone technologies. So Justin's background is he was actually a pilot in the South African Air Force, and he left the Air Force to take up cybersecurity. So Justin is now the Chief Technology Officer at Datagrate. Datagrate have got their head offices in Pretoria, but they are a regional African cybersecurity firm operating on the continent. And Justin's specialities are in cyber risk management. His background, key skills, penetration testing, digital forensics. He loves developing solutions, and he still enjoys a good deal of training, and he's still working quite hard on drone technologies as well, just as a sideline. And Justin is very involved in cloud security and securing companies, big companies, for example, in the mining industry, who have a lot of additional equipment that is coming online, this intersection between operational technologies and in the industrial Internet of Things. And today, Justin's going to give us an overview on the Mitre attack framework and how to use this to approach OT, IIoT security. You can go and have a look in the chat a bit later. I'm going to repost the link to the Mitre attack framework for dummies. It's a lovely intro booklet introducing you to the Mitre attack framework. So I'll pop the link in the Q&A and you can download it for free. Justin, without me hogging the floor, I'm going to hand over to you, and really looking forward to your lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. Hi, everyone. Justin here. If Noel, as always, please, just a reminder, timekeeping in case I get verbal diarrhea. Thank you. And basically, I think today, for me, when we first started chatting about this, I think I'm going to take the dummies guide approach, for lack of a better description. The reason for that is I think that it's very important that when we just touch on the Mitre attack framework, but I really want to touch on the OT side of things, the industrial IoT side of things. As Noel said, I am from Datagrate. Been very fortunate to be part of Datagrate for a few years now. But just in terms of what you can expect for the time as we go about, it's just basically in terms of agenda, the introduction into Datagrate very briefly, then touching on cybersecurity in the OT and industrial IoT space. A quick brief, let's call it the super sport blitz around the Mitre attack framework. And then we're going to start touching on a bit more about the challenges, what we experience day to day on a tactical and operational level, I'm going to say two worlds converge, because I know the focus is on OT and industrial IoT. And then I also it's very important for us to start differentiating between ICS and SCADA, or industrial control systems, and how those frameworks typically look from an architectural perspective. So just very quickly, first of all, thank you to everyone here. I really hope you get some value out of it. And if you don't, I'm sorry. But just a bit of background. Datagrate started in 2009. We've got more than 20 employees, always been a niche company, started in the data space and eventually moved across into not just data, but backup, and then archiving, security around data, and then into cybersecurity, and fully fledged into the future. We've also gone into OT, industrial IoT, and going forward. So, our focus has been the data plane, for lack of a better description, and obviously, as part of our data orchestration journey, the security that drives that. So we are fortunate to have some good relationships with, for example, the Nelson Mandela Mining Precinct, with some exciting and new stuff that we're doing there in terms of research and development of converged cybersecurity standards, especially when it's the convergence of risk in IT, OT, industrial IoT, and IoT. We don't focus, we are fairly industry agnostic. We also have a good relationship with the financial services sector, where you would also see that from a compliance perspective, the FSCO, the Financial Services Conduct Authority, has released certain joint standards towards cyber resilience, cyber hygiene, and IT cyber risk. And so for that reason, whether it's the financial services sector, automotive manufacturing, mining sector, or enterprise, we are fortunate to be in those. And that is why I'm thankful to be here today, because obviously in those industries that we do work quite a lot when we talk about OT and industrial IoT. We've got some good experience in the past, even with telecommunications, in understanding legacy systems and how that fits in together. So first of all, I think it's important that we consider cybersecurity when we talk about OT and industrial IoT. We need to be sure we're all on the same page. And the reality is that when we look at manufacturing, energy, transportation, healthcare, telecommunications, cybersecurity, we know, is people-driven, right? So, if we talk data security, our focus is on data. When we talk, network security, our focus is on the network. When we talk cybersecurity, we're talking about the people. And one of the things that's rather interesting that we've come to see when we specifically look at cybersecurity in the OT and industrial IoT environment is where, who's responsible for that, and what are the typical unique challenges around that. And the first thing is the obvious one, and that's legacy systems, because many OT systems were designed and implemented long before we considered cybersecurity as a thing, right? Long before cybersecurity were actually a significant concern. And with the focus being rather on reliability and safety than security, the result has kind of led to this ability to rather, let's update or patch 3 months from now or 6 months from now. And this has increased the vulnerability of the modern cyber threats on the existing legacy platform external attack surface. And those legacy systems, what we've also found is you get this traditional OEM lock-in. And this is also different. What makes different when we talk cybersecurity in the OT and industrial IoT domain is when we talk legacy systems, we need to understand there's this thing like OEM lock-in. And that is that typically engineers were driving the OT systems in a plant that's manufacturing, for example, or the engineers were driving certain systems in the mine that were doing certain things. And the same with healthcare and all the different industries. Now, today, what we find is that we need to converge IT and OT, right? And this presents the second unique challenge. And that is, if we're converging IT and OT, well, what is the trend now in terms of that actual risk? What is the trend in terms of threats? We need to be able to consider that, because that is rather unique when we talk about OT and industrial IoT. So now just imagine, we just spoke about legacy systems that OEMs typically safeguard the engineering components, and the people who work with the OEMs are actually engineers. But now we're converging IT and OT, we're putting those two worlds together. And some people, not everyone, some people are going and saying, well, we first need to, before we migrate from legacy OT to industrial IoT, let's convert IT and OT first, which in a certain environment would probably make sense, right? I think we can all agree on that. But should that be the way forward, what is the impact and who is responsible? Because if engineers are responsible for the engineering components of OT, OEMs are responsible for the actual manufacturing items or the OT equipment. Now you have network engineers that you expect to safeguard your OT environment. That's a rather unique situation you're sitting with, right? And this speaks to why, when we touch on the Mitre framework, Mitre attack framework, and we start looking at the ICS components of that, why I always would like everyone in the back of their head to understand that we're talking cybersecurity first, and that although the Mitre attack framework will help us now to go through the different phases of, whether it be a risk treatment plan, whether it be action plan, whatever the case might be, incident response plan, doesn't really matter. But I want us to consider that who are those people that actually need to do that, because of the convergence of legacy OT systems and IT systems. The third thing that is rather interesting is that because of this, all of this that's taking place, right, there's an increase in the sophistication of those cyber threats. And the reason for that is if you look at your traditional OSI or open source interconnect or OSI model, for those who, however you want to reference it, you've got 7 levels, and that's what you've got. And that's the interconnectedness of systems, right? And that is traditionally built on the IT architecture with networking as the background. Well, you will see when we start referencing, for example, the Purdue model, now again, even on an architectural perspective, we have this, I won't say a clash, but more considerations. More considerations actually lead to increased sophistication of specific threats because of those gaps. And it's important. So just to recap, if we think cybersecurity from OT and industrial IoT, the unique challenges I want to reference and highlight are the legacy systems that we sit with in OT, and whether we are doing a digital migration from OT to industrial IoT, or whether this is a convergence path between IT and OT. The reality is we end up with more sophisticated threats, but also we're sitting with different gaps and holes in our essentially in our security fabric. Now, what is the Mitre attack framework? So first of all, the reality is that it's just a globally accessible knowledge base with a whole bunch of columns and a whole bunch of rows, and it basically breaks down the adversary tactics and the techniques, those TTPs that we often talk about, and it's based in breaking it down in real world observations. Now, I want to discuss the objective, because I think the objective of it is a bit more important, because I don't really want to jump in too much of the nuts and bolts. But the reality is that as this comprehensive matrix, you will see that in the enterprise matrix, and we're not touching ICS yet, because we'll show a couple of differences later, but you will have all of these TTPs broken down from reconnaissance, credential access, resource development discovery, initial access, lateral movement, all these different phases it's broken down into. And so the objective behind the framework, as is all these different components of it, essentially is to say the core objectives is, first of all, we need to standardize threat modeling. And that, I think, is the beauty from an operational perspective as to why the Mitre attack framework has a positive approach. And the objective is really, it facilitates operational adoption quite well, because it provides this common language, right, and a systematic approach for the security operations center or your security teams to actually go describe what is happening, be able to share information about the adversary's behavior, and identify from reconnaissance all the way to impact, say, look, this is where I found it, this is what it looked like. But over and above the standardization in terms of its objective, enhancing detection and response is quite important. Now, with standardization being the first phase, the beauty of this is it takes us into our next phase, which says, how do I, and let's be honest, let's quickly touch on the skills gap in cybersecurity, as well as not just OT, cybersecurity, and IoT, industrial IT, but IT, right? Our standard, the skills gap. Now, if you consider the skills gap, what is the best way to buy yourself time? First of all, if you standardize, you can have a framework. But more often than not, frameworks are there for compliance, governance, right? Or they will go governance, risk, and compliance, GRC. And we tick these boxes. The beauty of standardizing a model like the attack Mitre framework means that if we were to initiate a higher level cybersecurity framework, like the NIST framework, for example, now suddenly we're in this position where in identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, in those 5 core objectives of NIST, and I'm aware that govern is the 6th one in 2.0, but for now I just want to reference the first 5, is that in identify, protect, and detect, we can use something like the Mitre attack framework and start using artificial intelligence for our threat modeling, because we've standardized it. And so when we get into the ICS side, I will touch a bit more on the differences. And this is opinion, right? This is not fact, but my opinion is that when it comes to the adoption of something like the Mitre attack framework, and the fact that you've got standardized threat modeling that allows us all to speak the same language, then I do not see any fear I don't see any harm, rather, in taking identify, protect, and detect, and using artificial intelligence and machine learning on a massive data scale, but ensuring that the human is in control of respond and recover. And this takes me to that point of enhancing detection and response, because not only do we have specific adversarial behavior, but the framework helps all organizations to improve your detection and response strategies. And because of that, you can actually more easily start implementing things like AI and machine learning. Now, just taking this on to the next step is that and one of the other core objectives of the framework in and of itself is guiding security improvements. Because we know security is cyclic, right? It's a process. It's never an end state. What we do have is that every single time we can standardize a threat, we can speak the same language, we can enhance our detection and response. And suddenly we can now find our gaps and assists us in that proactive gap analysis. So by being able to identify the gaps and prioritize our security improvements, actually the Mitre attack framework sits as a very good operational framework in terms of facilitating a risk-based approach to our security management in an operational environment. And that's the third thing that I think is very much a core objective of the framework. Now, the fourth thing I want to touch on in this specific attack framework is because it's operational, it also, and because we're all speaking the same language, because of standardized threat modeling, we are in a position that we can facilitate threat intelligence sharing. And a framework, I'm a firm believer in a framework that always speaks to facilitating threat intelligence sharing. So whether you are using in your organization, there's sticks and taxi in terms of protocols, in terms of how you can share this, just starting off with something like the Mitre attack framework does facilitate, because we speak the same language, when I share it with you, we're always sharing the same information. And that doesn't become a risk, right? In terms of us sharing it, I share it with you, I'm okay with that. We're all sharing the same data. And it also allows us to foster a collaborative approach to cyber defense. And that's rather rare, I must be honest, in terms of that. Whether it's a financial services sector, yes, it's nice. We've got Fabric and those kinds of structures that can support us in the financial services sector. But then you go to other sectors, for example, the mining sector, and everybody is in their own little silo. And I really do believe that that is one of the core objectives that Mitre attack framework actually does facilitate, is the facilitation of threat intelligence sharing. And then finally, when we have structures and everyone's speaking the same language and we're able to share, most importantly is we are able to learn. And that is very important, because it also, the output of the adoption of this framework can do both internal, or facilitate both internal and external education and training. And it can serve rather as an educational tool for understanding adversarial tactics and training security professionals at the end of the day, in terms of recognizing it. So although we don't mind, well, I don't mind AI recognizing something, but when it comes to mitigating that threat, you know what, the sooner we can respond, the sooner we can recover, the better for everybody at the end of the day, because we're reducing impact. So those are the 5 things for me, or the core objectives of it, is the standardizing in terms of threat modeling, enhancing detection and response, guiding security improvements as you go through the process, facilitating threat intelligence sharing, and finally being able to do all 4 of those things. It actually can serve as educational tools, both internally and externally, for education and training. Now, having said quite a lot, I would like to really touch on understanding OT, because now we understand the objectives of the Mitre attack framework. So let's talk OT. OT has a rather significant role that it plays when it comes to controlling physical processes. Hence the reason it's not driving information, it's driving operations. And therefore, you get these cyber physical streams that start connecting. And you will see in some research papers, there are slight differences, but some people will start talking on cyber physical, the impact of cyber physical integrations on the mines, for example, underground, above ground. But the reality is we need to start just with operational tech and talk from there. Now, if you remember the OSI or the RT model, or Open Systems Interconnect, whichever is your preference, pick your poison. But if you're going to have a look at understanding the OT, this now we have an example of the Purdue model. And whether you're using, ISA 95 or using the IEC ISA, what's it, the 63442, 65442, can't remember offhand, it doesn't really matter. The reality is that you've got these structures in architectural, and you can see right at the bottom, we aren't looking the way we typically and traditionally look at our 7 layers. We're starting at level 0 and saying we have sensors, we have actuators, and we have field devices. On top of that, and that's a process, that's an operational process being driven. And if we were to dare put this all into any specific, or try to map it into OSI level, we need to understand that levels 0, 1, 2, and possibly even almost 3, depending on where we're lying with our SCADA, right? So we can see SCADA lies level 2, 0 and 1 would be kind of like level 1. If we're talking the OSI model. Now, what is different is that from a process, you have a basic control. From a basic control, you have a supervisory control, and then you have operations management, and that all lies very traditionally all on site, whether it be in the plant, in the mine, whatever the case might be. The problem, however, that we have when we consider OT is that because IT drives information, any failure in a process or a failure in a control in the IT environment, it does not lead to the loss of life or limb. And that's very important. And sorry, I reference it like that because, that's how we talk about cyber warfare, right? There's some kinetic ending in terms of loss of life and limb. And this is not to take it lightly, but we need to understand that OT is no different. We have to take the approach and understand a failure of a control in OT leads to the loss of life or limb. And therefore, the way we implement controls also needs to be different. And if we just look at this, we will see that OT encompasses the systems that manage, monitor, and control all our industrial operations with a focus on the physical devices and the processes that they govern. So those processes, if we think logically now, let's put the risk hat on and let's talk about this and say, okay, but if we were to take a risk-based approach in our organization, what do we prioritize when, where, and how? And because we can lose life and limb when a control fails in OT, if we look at our InfoSec principles and the prioritization of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, then when we talk OT, availability needs to come first, then integrity, and then confidentiality. And that's quite clear in levels 0, 1, 2, and 3, because any failures there could and possibly will lead to loss of life and limb. When we change that and we talk about IT, our philosophy is confidentiality first, then integrity, and then availability. And please understand, I'm generalizing to a large degree, but that is the risk hat that we need to put on. So how then do we converge this with IT? How do we converge OT and IT? Now, that is quite important, and integrating an IT and OT can therefore offer certain levels of increased efficacy but first we need to understand there's different priorities. IT systems prioritize the confidentiality, OT systems availability and reliability. Then we also need to understand that there are distinct life cycles that are different. That is why in an OT system, it to a certain degree is okay for us to go ahead and patch every 3 months, for example, if we're talking about vulnerability life cycles. But IT hardware and software have shorter life cycles compared to OT, which means that they can be in service for longer, but it also complicates things like integration processes and updates, patches and all the rest. The third thing I want to highlight about that in understanding OT is that we have divergent protocols and standards. I just mentioned ISA for OT, but we might talk something totally different for IT. So OT systems often use proprietary protocols on networking level, but then also when it comes to standardizing, IT uses standardized protocols. And now this makes not only the integration challenging on that level, on a networking and protocol level, but even on standards and frameworks if we talk in risk. So we need to also bear that in mind. Finally, I want to just conclude with the discussion on risk again, because we're suddenly going to jump now from OT, we're going to jump ahead into industrial IoT, and then we'll see a little bit of a different picture. But please remember the risk management approach in which the IT environment is accustomed to rapid change management and risk-taking for innovation, for example, right? Where OT, the change is gradual and it's a very risk-averse environment because you want to avoid disruption because of the possibility of loss of life and limb. And so we need to overcome the integration challenges, right, when it comes to a strategic approach to that integration by focusing and respecting the differences in life cycle priorities, risk management practices, and then we will only be able to look at that integration. So, and this is not 100% industrial IoT, but I want to show you an example of how, for example, you can take IT and integrate into the cloud. You can take OT integrate into the cloud if you are planning to migrate from OT to industrial IoT with on-premise or linking it to the cloud. And this is just an example of how this has been done before. Within our environment, we've seen this as well. We've also implemented it in the mining sector. So now you should hopefully recognize on the left-hand side, we have level 0 all the way to level 5 again. But the difference is that we are segmenting and separating the output of the IT and the OT, and how they connect. And the reason for that is we find often, and this is again customer preference, and this is largely, this is not the be all or end all, please. This is an example. We get greenfield deployments, we get brownfield deployments, and we also get digitalization strategies in different phases of migrating from OT to industrial IoT. So again, please, this is an exploratory example of what we've done with specific people and actually a specific customer. Is now we keep the PLCs and we keep the SCADA, because the reality is that when we switch out OT equipment to industrial IoT equipment, if we have a look, and I'll just quickly see if I can get a pen up here. If we have a look, and let's consider this quickly, is think about this just quickly. The difference between OT and industrial IoT. The major, if we think quickly about industrial IoT, refers to a network of physical objects, equipment, machinery, and devices embedded with sensors, software, and other technologies. So they are now embedded with that software as well. Which traditionally the OT was using RS-232 or 485, whatever you're using, and that would have to connect with a little wire into some little sort of a, let's call it a dumb brain, and that would have to connect again to some SCADA, and so on and so forth. So actually, where I drew the red line, would it not logically say at very least, if we're switching out OT in our digitalization strategy to industrial IoT, to a large degree, our processes, basic controller and supervisory controller is probably my firmware and my hardware is now on the same device. And sometimes, not always, sometimes we would now include this level over here. Sorry, shucks. Quickly go back. Apologies for that. Just want to get my pen back. And sometimes we would even be doing something like that, right? And so that depends largely on the OEM, the vendor, and what we're doing. So do you see that whether you are trying to integrate IT and OT together, or whether you are trying to migrate from OT to industrial IoT, this model, as an example, could facilitate both the OT-IT convergence in the cloud, as well as future-proof you with this or a similar design, future-proof you when it comes to industrial IoT. So I hope that makes sense, because if you can see this, you can understand this, then planning your approach, because now let's think about this quickly. We said CIA and AIC are switched. So if my IT stream in level 5 is pushing to the cloud and I have a security operations center monitoring that, and oh, by the way, they're using the Mitre attack framework to go through the processes of threat modeling and threat hunting, and I do the same for OT, and OT and IT can land in the same database, well, now I can have that and I can start doing something with it. And therefore, because I'm in that position, when it comes to migration from OT to industrial IoT, my packets are the same, my data is in the same lake, I have my historical data, I don't lose my intelligence over time of my TTPs and of my adversaries that were attacking me. Okay, wait, hold on. So actually taking a security by design approach to this and acknowledging or adopting something like the Mitre attack framework can be a huge step in actually moving towards the digitalization process and or migration of OT to industrial IoT. And that's why what I wanted to take, just say one last thing is, therefore, when we now do a benefits analysis in terms of how we can enhance industrial processes by adopting industrial IoT in the future, we can now start seeing both on a framework level using the Mitre attack framework, for ICS or for OT, either way, whichever one you want to subscribe it to in terms of naming conventions, or the IT side. Suddenly we can have increased efficiency, we can have predictive maintenance, we can have better enhanced security, better decision making. And although we have an increased attack surface, we are still acknowledging the importance of data privacy and integrity. So this would facilitate that. And I think this is why also I wanted to show the differences in these two slides, is to show the reduced impact by starting on an operational level to achieve a strategic objective, which sometimes is the migration or the digitalization of legacy OT to industrial IoT. So I hope that makes sense. Right, so one of the biggest cybersecurity challenges, and we did speak about three specific topics, legacy OT systems and all of that, in terms of considering cybersecurity and OT and industrial IoT. We need to also consider that there are very specific challenges. And if we consider the previous screen or the previous slide, the first thing hopefully that you noted was network segmentation is going to be a nightmare. And the reason for that is because there's going to be an engineer for the OT stuff that's going to be fighting with somebody in GRC, with somebody in management who needs to look after the network, and the network guy needs to look after the network segmentation. And so often what we can see is that there's inadequate separation of the networks that do allow attackers to move laterally within systems. And that is why the previous framework is one that I subscribe to and I feel quite passionate about, because if you can fix that down, and you've got a Mitre attack framework for identifying your threats and actually being able to go through those processes, it will to a large degree reduce your risk by adopting that first before you adopt a migration strategy from OT to industrial IoT, because the small things matter, like, for example, insufficient network segmentation, that with time you can gather more information, you can open up the ports a little bit more, get a little bit more data as you start introducing industrial IoT devices. The other one, the obvious one, which I touched on previously, is unpatched systems. OT environments, we spoke about the life cycle, the extended life cycle of OT environments, and obviously the fact that that equipment cannot easily be updated or patched, leaving known vulnerabilities in those specific environments unaddressed. But this is where there's a trade-off, and where taking a risk-based perspective is quite important to reduce some of these challenges. And the reason I say that is, with vendor lock-in, OEM, and I'm not going to mention OEMs, but an OEM is going to say, but you are paying me to patch that. You're paying me to reduce the vulnerabilities, make sure the firmware is working, blah, 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 blah. But suddenly you find that the SCADA system needs to run on Windows XP, and management has said you need to migrate from OT. First, you need to convert IT and OT, and then go to the cloud, and then migrate from OT to industrial IoT. And that is where the unpatched systems will burn you, quite frankly, and create a big gap in your risk. And that's, again, why the Mitre attack framework for monitoring your threats, being able to identify them and have a much quicker MTTR should something happen, is going to actually get you where you need to be if you take that approach. Then weak authentication. We do find this, you're going to laugh, but we do find this in the OT environment, because the OT environment has probably never been connected. And so for that reason, guess what? there's Justin. He's been working there as an engineer for the last 25 years in the same plant. He's worked himself up. Why does he need to change his password? Nobody's going to get here, right? And this is a big cybersecurity challenge because there's also cultural difference. Let's call a spade a spade. The engineer in the OT environment works under a different culture with different objectives to the IT guys, to the cybersecurity guys, to the security operations system, and that does cause an issue. So something as simple as weak authentication with default or simple credentials because OT didn't require it, or even worse, OT doesn't know better because it's 20 years old or it's 15 years old or whatever the case might be. So it cannot even take a password that long or with that kind of sophistication. And then real-time monitoring. And that's, again, where the Mitre attack framework comes in and really shines, because without continuous oversight, these malicious activities will take place. And that is the thing, right? If you plug your OT into IT, your network segmentation must be, but when you go lights on, the first people to go lights on must be security. And then your digitalization strategy or migration strategy for OT to industrial IoT can take place. It cannot be the networking guys and the OEMs are pulling out and plugging in, and security has not come first in terms of that view. As a matter of interest, in the first half of 2023, the industrial sector globally, right, saw a significant uptick, rather, 34% increase in ICS, in industrial computer systems actually being, control systems rather, being hit. And in terms of the energy sector, globally, there was a 36% increase in that specific sector. So this is nothing new. We all know it. Those of us who do work in that environment, yes, get bags under our eyes, especially when people who you're trying to protect, it's going to switch off a proxy or whatever it is that you need to start monitoring. But that's the reality of it. And don't think that irrespective of your, we have this discussion even with small financial service providers. If you're going to have a look at Russia, right? That hackers actually hacked in to just change the temperature. Chinese hackers hacked into Russia to change the temperature of 40 tons of frozen meat storage. And they changed the temperature and it all rotted. Now, can you imagine, with the existing global conflict, what is the impact of frozen meat going rotten? 40,000 tons of frozen meat. How many soldiers could that have fed? And what is the impact of that? So, just a bit of an example of what we need to be thinking of. Right? Trust me, a hungry soldier having come from an environment as a grumpy soldier, he's not going to want to work, right? Soldiers work for two things. One of them is food. So that is just an example of some things happening out there. So what does it look like? And, what's interesting about the Mitre attack for ICS, and, we touched on a couple of various of those various components, but it is specifically an extension of the Mitre attack framework for industrial control systems that's tailored to the needs and the threats facing ICS and critical infrastructures and that which they support. Now, this is just an example. This is a screenshot that I actually took just so that you could have a little bit of a look, and I have redacted it, so you will not see everything. But what you will see is that just in terms of what was found, we can see that, and this is just a simple breakdown of how it lies, is there's obviously a PCAP for the network traffic, and that PCAP we had access to because we're monitoring it in a real-time environment. It was automatically put into a risk rating for us and a specific status. We could see the source device, and there you can see its HMI. So there you can see its human-machine interface. It is sitting within that. This isn't some ITM Mitre attack demonstration. And you will see over here that within all of those, it lies within the discovery phase. Now, if we were to go and have a look at that specific technique with what happened there, because it's discovery, and we see a number over here, T0841, if we were to go here, we would have to go and look up T0841. So now, because I had to redact some of it, I unfortunately can't show you, but here you can see the identification, the name of what occurred, and the description of that. So now we've got our TTPs laid out for us. And this is an example of exactly how it is different. from, or an extension. It's not different. Pardon me. It's an extension of the Mitre attack framework. So here you can see that within the tactics under ICS, where we had all of those other ones on the previous slides, we now have initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, evasion, discovery, lateral movement, collection, command and control, inhibit response function, impair process control, and impact. And so if you were to go and compare the two slides from the standard Mitre attack framework and the ICS, you will suddenly start seeing where ICS actually is different. So I'm just going to zoom out there that you guys can see the full slides. And the ICS environments, we are talking obviously about your power plants, your water treatment facilities, your manufacturing plants. I spoke about the Russian attack and the defrosting or the thawing and the rotting of the meat because of that. And the framework, essentially, what's nice about it, it categorizes tactics as the why behind the action. So essentially, it's establishing a foothold within the network, disrupting an industrial process. And that framework categorizes quite nicely, but also the techniques on the other side describe the how, right? So if I've got the why and I've got the how, and the where is now in ICS, well, suddenly I think we're in a pretty good space, right? And just a couple of examples of that is the initial access, which speaks to methods adversaries would use to gain entry into it, the impact of the actions aimed at disrupting the operations. So what's nice is essentially the extension of this gives us not the who, but it gives us the why, the how, and we know where. And those three things is what stands out in terms of the successes of implementing the attack framework for ICS or even just in the IT environment. And that is collectively how that works.
Justin?
The question, yes, question.
Sorry, you got about 10 minutes to go.
Good gracious me. Okay, thank you. I told you I can waffle. So those of you who aren't asleep yet, my apologies. Right. So I'm going to super sport blitz through this quickly because the question is often, well, now I've got this. I understand the constraints, IT and OT, understand where the different Mitre attack frameworks come in operationally, and I understand how it helps reduce my risk when I apply it, even as part of a digital migration strategy. What do I do? First of all, understand the framework, right? Begin with a thorough understanding of the Mitre attack framework, specifically for ICS and the ICS matrix, because it is a little bit different, although the outcomes are the same. Then you would go and map your current security posture against that framework. And I know most of you are probably sitting with your own SOC teams and all the rest, and that's great. But from a risk perspective, because often you see governance, risk, and compliance, once a list, tick box. Auditor comes, checks the tick boxes. The poor security operations center said, what the hell are you asking me to fill in now? Of course I'm doing this. Say, but where and how? I think there's a policy. Please go back and ask GRC. Okay, so by understanding the framework and then mapping your own current security posture against this is going to help you do a gap analysis. And especially if you're sitting with, and I'll be quite frank, I don't care if you're strategic, tactical, or operational. In terms of this deployment, you have to understand the framework, even if you don't understand how to use it or how to execute it. Because the third thing, and we've touched on this, and that was the positives, if you remember, the objectives of the Mitre attack framework actually tell you how to do it. Because now, once you've done that gap analysis in the mapping the current security posture, you can enhance your own detection and response. Again, an objective of the framework. Because implementing the detection strategies for specific techniques as outlined in the framework, suddenly you can update and deploy new security tools and technologies, see how it reduces your risk, and suddenly see how cybersecurity and something like the Mitre attack framework will drive you towards achieving a strategic objective, right? Then the obvious one, training and awareness in terms of the specifics of the Mitre attack framework for ICS. But then engaging, again, depending on, I want to say depending on staff turnover, but we've got so limited skills anyway. If you're not documenting your own intelligence, who's attacking you, if you're not getting third-party intelligence, if you're not sharing it in industry-specific forums, mining industry, financial services, doesn't really matter. If you're not doing that, then that's a very good place actually to loop back in. right? Once you've gone through this process. And then finally is the improvement, continuous improvement, by regularly reviewing and updating security posture and saying, I have received intelligence. What can I do with that intelligence? Now we can actually start driving the traditional intelligence life cycles, right? Because it doesn't matter if it's IT or OT, I drive an intelligence life cycle that feeds into this adoption life cycle, as I've kind of put it in here. And then we can once again start creating loops, because what comes out at intelligence sharing for continuous improvement, I can actually go put back over there. And then I run down here again. So all I ask is, do yourself a favor, start looking at the framework, understand the framework, because what I've shown you there will facilitate an operational lifecycle that will support a cybersecurity lifecycle in terms of embetterment at the end of the day of all of this. And so the strategies for threat detection and response are, have a look at the basics. Once again, what do I do? Make sure we always talk about assets, vulnerabilities, and threats, the core three things. So know myself, know the enemy. Know myself, assets, vulnerabilities, and threats. Know the enemy, method, opportunity, and motive. How do I actually implement that? Ensure you've got a comprehensive asset inventory. Ensure your network segmentation as it is now relative to what it is. So the as is, to be, and final in your digitalization process from going from OT to industrial IoT. Remember, also driven by your threat, your Mitre attack framework, anomaly detection, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Remember those. The first three, let's use AI if we can. Why not? It will assist in anomaly detection, vulnerability assessments. Obviously, we do those vulnerability assessments, but be careful. Obviously, you get active and passive. There are pros and cons to both of those. Securing remote access, because this is going to take place over time. And again, as I said, this approach does support not just converged IT and OT, but it also supports digitalization from OT to industrial IoT. So make sure that that incident response plan has an appendix, not just for as is, but for to be as well. And then you would be pretty covered. So let's quickly touch on the future of OT and industrial IoT. Yes, the risk between the IT and OT is just going to increase over time. I do believe that. We see it in some industries like the mining industry that take a bit, well, significantly longer for adoption, medical industry that's actually significantly more advanced. We do see that, and that does increase. So emerging trends are definitely a greater gray area, a greater convergence of risk, not necessarily convergence of actual networks. Then the second thing I want to point out is the adoption and use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. It will play, I just firmly believe in the future, is going to play a crucial role in enhancing our industrial IoT applications, especially when it comes to predictive maintenance. You know, things like energy management in Africa, we're seeing this already in the telecommunications space, for example. Edge computing, by no means, we must not forget about that, because edge computing is driven. It's actually not driven, it's rather driving the industrial IoT wave at the moment, because if I can do it there and I can have that brain on site, and then I can just start increasing, things like industrial automation. It really helps a lot. And then the last two things that I want to touch that I think are going to be important in the future is everybody likes talking about blockchain. I don't know if blockchain is going to enhance security. I don't want to mention Bitcoin specifically because I have my own opinions on that, but I do think strategic implementation of blockchain, even although some might deem it just to be an inherently decentralized, unstable database, I do think that there might be place for that. If industrial IoT is going to harness and expedite decentralized decision-making, I think the decentralized nature of blockchain could enhance certain aspects of security in future industrial IoT deployments. And then finally, government intervention. Governments across the world are slow. Let's call a spade, but we are fortunate that we have the likes of NIST or the National Institute of Standards and Technology to reference. And for example, NIST 800-82, revision 3 specifically, you can go and have a look at IT security, OT rather, security guides. And we even have the Industrial IoT Consortium, which, although not a framework, but rather a security kind of approach to all of this, I think if governments can start using those and at least adopting a first of something, we can make it better. So I think that in terms of future, those are the 5 aspects that I think will be focused on, where we are now, where we are going. And definitely the importance of continuous monitoring and adaptation through the life cycle that I showed previously on the screen. I think if we can do those things, we can successfully get IT and OT to meet. I think we can successfully use operational frameworks like the Mitre attack framework. And, because ICS is just an extension of the original Mitre attack framework, I think that operational stability can provide a secure environment for any future digitalization processes that meet specific strategic needs. Did I make my time?
Thank you, Justin. Awesome. Good landing.
Thank you.
Appreciate this. Thank you very, very much. You're getting a great round of applause from our audience. We have the most awesome students on this course. Okay, so I see one hand up. I'm going to start with the Q&A, and then I will revert to the hands up. So, Justin, you've at least got 5 questions to get through here. So try not to expound too much. Sure. On, over-invested.
Super sport. Super sport place. Sure.
Okay, so first up is Ishmael Matabula. And Ishmael asks the question, hi, Justin, do you use tools, which tool or technology, to integrate it to this framework to automate threat modeling, or is it a manual process where a team needs to sit and work in a spreadsheet? Could you provide a typical practical scenario or insights into how specific tactics and techniques outlined in the framework are incorporated into threat modeling practices to enhance cybersecurity resilience? You've also got a Q&A, by the way, if you just want to, up at the top, the Q&A, if you just want to also, follow the questions.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. I think I'm going to see there's a whole bunch suddenly, so I'm going to skip. You can read it to me. So on this thing. Anyway, so no, thank you for the good question. First of all, are there tools? Absolutely. We as part of what we actually do in the mining industry, financial service industry, we actually assist customers in finding the best solution for what works with them. Because what you will find is in reality, your firewall is probably to a certain degree doing something like that for you already, but it would not necessarily break it down into a security operations center. So are there tools? Absolutely, many tools. Typically, you can find data, because remember, this is a data-driven approach. And I think that's important to acknowledge. Without the data, we don't know. So if you're taking a compliance approach to this, then by all means, open up a spreadsheet. I wouldn't recommend it. But yes, there are tools that can facilitate that. Alternatively, the more data you have, the better. And that's why I made the recommendation to say, whoever's out there, if you're integrating IT and OT, have a look at what you've got, because what you've got is giving you data. The data that you've got needs to, as best possible, be centralized, and then you can consider all of that data in one to start creating. And that's why in the Identify, Protect, Detect, Respond, and Recover of NIST, I always recommend that customers do consider using AI where possible. Speak to your OEMs, speak to consultants, speak to us. We can advise as well where there's those types of questions, but use the data you've got. There's this tendency for vendors wanting to rip and replace everything, right? And say, when mine's the best, okay, let's get real, guys. Nobody's going to rip and replace. These environments are too big. Let's use what you've got, feed that into a central data lake, apply AI for Identify, Protect, and Detect. By doing that, you will be able to extract, according to your framework, your TTPs. So whether you're getting data from your servers, your endpoints, your firewalls, your if you've got smart switches, whatever the case might be, get that into a single place, and then kind of apply the framework.
Thanks very much, Justin. Now from Mark Harris. How big of a challenge is OEM proprietary in the industrial control systems in relation to interoperability between IT and OT architectures and frameworks?
I love that question. Thank you. From experience, man. Automotive manufacturing, you have, and I'm not going to mention names, but you're going to have one vendor uses a specific protocol, but a proprietary encryption between ICS and SCADA, for example, and now they want to move to the cloud, and to keep you locked in, they will say, look, this is where I'm going, this is what I want to do, and then you kind of got to be in or out. And I'll be honest, that is why we as consultants typically take a vendor agnostic approach, which is why to Ishmael's response, I don't want to name a vendor because then you're going to beat me with a stick if it's not your favorite or whatever the case might be. But rather, by being vendor agnostic, you can go and have a look at what is existing in the environment, because it is a challenge. In the mining industry, we have seen it to be a challenge. And and that's why I mentioned active versus passive scanning of environments. When you start holding your OEMs accountable, they don't like you. And we've seen this because we would, for example, monitor certain mines environments and be able to actually open up the packets and identify vulnerabilities in either software or within networking communications. And you go back to them and you say, but go and fix this. Right? And that's the only way how you can start getting your OEMs to change. But there is a culture of proprietary OEM deployments within that environment that are not transparent. Why? Because they don't make their money on the machine. They make their money on support and services thereafter. So it is a fairly large problem in and of itself. Now, in relation to interoperability between IT and OT architectural frameworks, it can become sticky if you do not sometimes, like the example I just gave you, we are using third-party software just for the customer to actually know what's happening in terms of assets and vulnerabilities in that environment. So instead of the OEM being transparent with us, we have to use third-party software to continuously monitor that environment in that ICS environment, ship that off to the cloud, append or rather dump in the IT data with it, and then come to some sort of threat modeling out of that. So it can be challenging depending on your environment and who the OEM is.
Thank you, Justin. I'm afraid I can't see the attendees in the meeting. I don't know if you can, so I can't see whose hands up.
I can see, yes.
I can see it, Noel. I can call on them.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Great. We have a Lufuno who has their hand up. I'm going to allow your mic, but you still have to unmute yourself. So please unmute yourself and ask Justin your question.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation. I don't necessarily have a question. I have never had access to the chat or Q&A. So I just wanted to ask if the framework can be emailed, because I can't even clap for Justin because I don't have those enabled on my side, but I enjoyed your presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. At least you didn't fall asleep. That's tick box 1.
Thank you, Lufuno. What we'll try and do is maybe put it out in the next sort of newsletter or email to the students, the Mitre Attack Framework for Dummies link for you to download. So thanks for bringing that to my attention.
Thank you.
Are there further questions?
I don't see any other hands raised at the moment. So guys, if you have a question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand, whatever you have access to.
I have one.
Great.
Justin, thank you. So Justin, I mean, obviously when, you started the lecture, we spoke about the risk to life when things go wrong with OT. And, you're thinking here also of massive government utilities, something like an Eskom or a Transnet or Rand Water or the financial system in South Africa, and that goes for the whole region. To what extent are you seeing a rise? Can you tell in terms of potentially sort of advanced threat actors not your random, but really advanced threat actors targeting critical industries or critical infrastructure. What's the chat on the ground there within cybersecurity circles? Do you want to share that with us?
That's a good question. I won't mention names, but
yeah,
I can say that retail, interestingly enough, very, very, very large, extensive attack on retail company at the end of December last year. It's a lot of work, a lot of people, a lot of effort went into actually getting them back online. You know, when you start talking about 450, 480 retail stores, and you know them getting hit, that's not funny. You know, that's some serious business. So I think what we need to bear in mind, and I say this with all due respect, if you are low-hanging fruit and you're in the government, or you're low-hanging fruit and you're a retailer, low-hanging fruit is low-hanging fruit. I mean, isn't that essentially the first principle, you know, method, opportunity, and motive? So if we want to understand and consider the attackers, you know, intelligence says the same. If there is a method and the opportunity presents itself and you're doing it by being low-hanging fruit, the motive we all know, right? So all an attacker needs is the opportunity. So that is very evident. So in a financial services sector, we tend to see more things like sextortion in smaller FSPs. Sextortion, ransomware, it's always going to be there. But if we talk national critical infrastructure, we talk ICS, SCADA, point of sale systems, the retail guys don't realize what a danger a point of sale system is, right? You know, and we are seeing adoption of a mass adoption rather of the likes of your little you know, eCorca devices. You know, I can go for $5.99, go to Macro, or you know, purchase myself a little card machine. But what is that if not just another system that's interconnected? How is it interconnected? And so I know what we are seeing is a massive and rapid expanse in the attack surface, but the low-hanging fruit are always going to be low-hanging fruit. And I think that's why it's so important to adopt frameworks that are operational and not just compliance frameworks.
Thank you, Justin. Well, we've actually reached our time limit. So what I'd like to say to the students is, first up, Justin, I'd like to thank you, and I'm sure all our participants here would like to thank you as well today. Thank you very, very much.
It's a pleasure.
And that's also a round of applause you're getting from the audience. This isn't the last time we'll be seeing you. We'll be seeing you in the challenges,
yep.
In the challenge phase. And that brings me to the next point, everybody, is we've got the challenge information session. It's not a long one. I highly recommend that you attend the challenge information system and that you take part in the challenges. The challenge offers you the opportunity to really dress up your CV quite a bit, and you're going to get some invaluable insights from industry, mentorship, and obviously project participation and management type experience to put on that CV, as well as, of course, an additional certificate. So, Justin, we're going to say thank you to you very much, and I'll ask the students to exit this room shortly, and then please go and join the challenge auditorium, if we can call it that. We're getting swears here. So very, very fancy. So thanks so much, Justin, and
Pleasure.
we'll see you soon in the challenge phase. And regards to all of data, great.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Ciao. Bye, everybody.